I used to believe that after 4 decades of judging other people's mistakes, nothing could truly surprise me anymore. The night I hosted my retirement dinner was supposed to be the closing chapter of a life spent weighing truth, listening carefully, and deciding who was telling it straight and who wasn't. Before this story goes any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone. Instead, it became the night I discovered that the person I trusted more than anyone else had been quietly planning my end. That was wrong. The irony still haunts me. After 43 years as a senior appellate judge, I chose to mark my retirement with a formal dinner at a historic restaurant overlooking the river downtown. It was the kind of place where the ceilings were high, the lighting soft, and the silverware so heavy it felt ceremonial in your hands. I wanted dignity. I wanted closure. I wanted, perhaps foolishly, to believe that my life's work had earned me a peaceful ending. There were 72 guests that evening. Former colleagues, clerks who had become judges themselves, attorneys who once trembled before my bench and later shook my hand as equals. And then there was family. Most importantly, there was my nephew. Daniel stood near the head table when I arrived, straightening place cards with meticulous care. At 45, he was tall, polished, confident in the way only successful men learn to be. He had my sister's smile and my father's intensity, though the latter had always unsettled me just a bit. Still, he was the closest thing I ever had to a son. I raised him after my sister died. I never married. I never had children of my own. When she was killed in a freeway collision almost 35 years earlier, Daniel came to live with me. He was 13, quiet, angry at the world, and terrified of being abandoned again. I gave him my spare bedroom, my time, my savings, and eventually my life. I taught him how to tie a tie. I sat through every school recital and graduation. I paid for private tutors when he struggled, then paid his law school tuition when he excelled. By the time he passed the bar, I had invested more than $300,000 into his future without ever once keeping track. And I would have given more. That night, as I stepped into the restaurant, applause broke out. Someone clinked a glass. Daniel smiled broadly and came toward me, arms open. "Uncle Thomas," he said, embracing me. "You did it. 43 years. That's history." I laughed. It feels heavier now that it's over. He gestured toward the room. Everyone wanted to be here. Judges from 3 districts, former students, even the governor's legal advisor. "You deserve this." His words were warm. His eyes, I noticed, did not quite linger on mine. At the time, I dismissed it. If you're watching this story unfold, stay with me until the end and tell me the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this night traveled beyond that room, because what happened next still echoes farther than I ever imagined. Dinner service began with practiced elegance. Candles flickered against dark wood walls. Crystal glasses caught the light, just so. When I reached my seat, I noticed a deep red wine already poured beside my plate. Daniel leaned in. "I remembered your favorite, a reserve Cabernet. I had them open it just for you." It was thoughtful, too thoughtful. I thanked him, touched despite myself. This was the young man who used to fall asleep at the kitchen table while I graded briefs. The boy who once asked me, at 16, if doing the right thing ever got easier. "It doesn't," I had told him, "but you get better at living with it." As guests settled, conversations bloomed around us. Laughter, memories, compliments that made me uncomfortable in that particular way praise always had. I reached for my napkin. That's when I saw it. Daniel glanced around, casually, the way people do when they think no one is paying attention. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket. His movement was smooth, practiced. He removed something small, pale, and held it between his fingers for barely a second. Then he leaned slightly toward my glass. I didn't breathe. The object dropped into the wine. There was a brief shimmer, a faint fizz that vanished almost instantly. If I hadn't been watching him, truly watching, I would have missed it entirely. 43 years on the bench had trained me to notice things other people overlooked. The twitch of a jaw, a pause before an answer, a hand that moved too carefully. Daniel straightened and smiled at me. "Shall we toast in a moment?" he said. "Before the first course?" The room felt suddenly distant, like I had been submerged underwater. The chatter dulled. The candlelight wavered. My heartbeat became the loudest thing I could hear. In that instant, everything I believed about my life, my family, and the man sitting beside me cracked, quietly, invisibly, just like whatever had dissolved in my wine. I nodded. Yes, I said evenly. A toast sounds perfect. I kept my hand wrapped around the stem of the wine glass, feeling its cool weight against my fingers, as if anchoring myself to something solid might slow the spiral happening inside my mind. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The guests were laughing. A waiter passed with a tray of appetizers. Somewhere behind me, someone was recounting a story about a disastrous trial from decades earlier. The room remained elegant, controlled, celebratory. Inside me, a reckoning had begun. 43 years of judicial discipline prevented my face from betraying what I had just seen. I had learned long ago that shock is a luxury best experienced in private. In public, especially under scrutiny, composure is armor. Daniel raised his own glass, swirling the wine absent-mindedly. "You look thoughtful," he said lightly. "Big night." "Just reflective," I replied. "That happens when a man closes a chapter." He nodded, satisfied, and turned to speak with the woman seated on his other side. I watched him from the corner of my eye, every movement now magnified, every gesture suspect. My mind raced backward, combing through recent months with the ruthless precision I once applied to case law. How'd I miss this? The first warning had come late in the spring, during one of our customary Sunday dinners. Daniel had arrived early, something he rarely did, carrying a leather folder under his arm. We ate quietly, and afterward he followed me into my study, glancing around as if seeing the room for the first time. "You've built quite a legacy here, Uncle Thomas," he said, gesturing toward the shelves lined with legal volumes and framed opinions. "Not just professionally. Personally." I smiled. "It's just a house full of books." "But it's more than that," he pressed. "The investments, the pension, the property. Have you reviewed your estate plan recently?" The question had surprised me then, though not enough to alarm me. Lawyers talk about such things. It's what we do. "My affairs are in order," I told him. "They've been reviewed within the last year." He hesitated. "I only ask because laws change, and you've worked hard for what you've earned. I'd hate for inefficiencies to diminish it." At the time, I had taken it as concern. Now, sitting in that restaurant with a poisoned glass inches from my lips, the memory took on a sharper edge. The second sign came a month later. Daniel visited my chambers unannounced, dropping by in the late afternoon when the courthouse was nearly empty. He sat across from my desk, unusually restless, fingers tapping against his knee. "You've thought about what comes next, right?" he asked. "After retirement." "I plan to rest," I said. "Read, travel, enjoy waking up without a docket." He smiled thinly. "And the house? What about it?" "It's large. Maintenance alone must be exhausting. You could downsize, free up capital, make life simpler." The suggestion stung more than I let on. That house had been our refuge after my sister died. Every hallway carried echoes of Daniel growing up, of scraped knees and late-night talks. "I'm not ready to leave it," I said. For a moment, frustration flickered across his face before disappearing behind a practiced smile. "Of course. I just worry about you managing everything alone." Alone. The word had landed harder than intended. The third warning arrived 2 weeks before the dinner, disguised as opportunity. Daniel asked to borrow against his future inheritance. "It's temporary," he assured me. "A development deal. Commercial property near the new transit corridor. The return could be triple within 2 years." I asked for details. He offered jargon. I pressed harder. He grew defensive. When I declined, suggesting traditional financing instead, disappointment crossed his face so quickly he couldn't mask it in time. "Understand," he said finally. "I'll figure something out." Now, as I watched him laugh with a retired justice across the table, the memory settled into place with sickening clarity. He hadn't been asking for help. He had been calculating. The fourth warning came from someone who had no reason to lie. Daniel's wife called me late one evening, her voice tight with worry. "Uncle Thomas," she said, "has Daniel seemed different to you?" She told me about late nights, secretive phone calls, articles she'd seen on his desk about medical emergencies, drug interactions, age-related vulnerabilities. I had reassured her then, convinced she was overthinking. I knew better now. As the waiter approached to take our orders, I stared at the dark red surface of the wine in my glass. Whatever Daniel had dropped inside, it had dissolved completely, leaving no trace, no warning. Only intent. Across from me, Daniel leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident, utterly convinced that the next few minutes would unfold exactly as he planned. And that was when I understood the most terrifying part of it all. He wasn't improvising. This had been thought through, timed, prepared, which meant I had to decide very quickly what kind of man I would be in the final moments of my career, the one who reacted emotionally or the one who applied the same restraint and judgment that had defined his life on the bench. I tightened my grip on the glass and waited. The waiter finished taking orders and moved on, leaving behind a brief pocket of quiet at our table. Cutlery rested neatly beside porcelain plates. The air carried the faint aroma of roasted herbs and warm bread. Daniel leaned toward me again. "We should do the toast now," he said. "Before the food arrives." There it was. The gentle nudge. The final encouragement. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt the weight of decades press down on my chest. I had watched men stand before me in courtrooms claiming innocence with the same relaxed confidence. I had listened to them describe plans that were almost perfect, undone only by some overlooked detail they never imagined would matter. Daniel believed he had accounted for everything. He raised his glass slightly, waiting. "Of course," I said. A toast would be fitting. My voice sounded steady, even to my own ears. That steadiness surprised me. Inside, my thoughts were racing, but my body responded the way it always had when the stakes were highest. Calm first, action second. As I reached toward my glass, my elbow brushed the edge of the table. Just enough. The fork slid from my place, setting and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Several heads turned. Someone chuckled. "I'm sorry," I said, already bending down. "These hands aren't as graceful as they used to be." What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Under the cover of the tablecloth, hidden from every pair of eyes above, I switched the glasses. Daniel's untouched wine slid into my place. The glass that held whatever he had chosen for me now sat beside him. When I straightened, fork in hand, my heart was pounding so fiercely I was certain someone must hear it. But my face remained neutral, my movements unhurried. A lifetime of discipline held. "I should ask for a clean fork," I added mildly. The waiter appeared immediately, apologetic, efficient. Daniel barely noticed. His attention was fixed on a moment he had been orchestrating all evening. "Now, then," he said, standing slightly in his chair, "if everyone will indulge me for a moment." Conversation faded. Nearby guests turned in their seats. Glasses were lifted around us, catching the candlelight like small stars. Daniel cleared his throat. "To my uncle," he began, his voice warm, confident, practiced, "a man who dedicated more than 4 decades to justice, who believed that truth mattered, even when it was inconvenient, who raised me when I had nowhere else to go." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. "He taught me that integrity isn't about what people see," Daniel continued, meeting my eyes, "but about what you choose when no one is watching." The irony was almost unbearable. Several guests smiled. One woman dabbed at her eyes. "He showed me that every decision carries consequences," Daniel said, lifting his glass higher. "That character is revealed not in success, but in moments of pressure." I stood slowly, raising my own glass, the clean one. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Your words mean more than you know." Applause followed. Polite, genuine, unaware. Daniel smiled at me, then brought his glass to his lips and drank deeply. I watched him swallow. For a brief, suspended moment, nothing happened. He exhaled, savoring the taste. "Excellent choice," he said, setting the glass down. "You still have impeccable taste." "Yes," I replied. "I do." Dinner resumed. Plates were served. Conversation returned, though I barely registered it. My attention remained fixed on Daniel, cataloging every breath, every gesture. At first, the changes were subtle. His speech lost a fraction of its sharpness. His laughter lingered a second too long. When he reached for his water, his hand trembled just slightly. "Are you feeling all right?" his wife asked, concern creeping in her voice. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just the excitement." Minutes passed. Then his color began to drain. He excused himself to the restroom, rising too quickly, nearly misjudging the distance to his chair. When he returned several minutes later, sweat glistened at his temples despite the cool room. "You don't look well," one of the judges remarked. Daniel forced a smile. Perhaps I had more wine than I realized. But his eyes flicked to me, and in them I saw the first spark of understanding. "Uncle Thomas," he said slowly, gripping the edge of the table. "Didn't you drop your fork earlier?" "Yes," I replied evenly. "Clumsy of me." His gaze moved from my glass to his. The color left his face entirely. "I think," he said, voice tight, "I need some air." He stood, then sat back down abruptly as his legs failed to cooperate. Crystal shattered as his water glass slipped from his grasp, drawing the attention of half the room. Panic bloomed around us. And in the center of it all, Daniel stared at me with naked fear. He knew. The room had changed without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it happened. There was no dramatic interruption to announce it. No single sound or movement that clearly marked the shift. Instead, it crept in slowly, almost politely, like a pressure change before a storm that only a few instinctively sense. Laughter that had once flowed freely between tables began to thin, losing its warmth. Conversations faltered mid-thought, trailing off into uneasy pauses. Someone laughed a second too late at a joke that no longer fit the mood, and the sound rang hollow, sharp against the sudden quiet. Chairs shifted across the polished floor, their legs scraping softly as people adjusted their posture, leaning forward without realizing they were doing so. Glasses hovered mid-air, then lowered again without being sipped. A waiter froze mid-step, his tray hovering uncertainly at chest height, eyes flicking between tables as if waiting for an unspoken signal that it was safe to move again. What had been a celebration moments earlier now carried the unmistakable tension of something going wrong. Not privately, not quietly, but in full view of too many witnesses for anyone to pretend it wasn't happening. I noticed how quickly people stopped smiling. Not all at once, but one by one. A ripple effect. A collective unease moving through the room like a current beneath still water. Daniel's wife dropped to her knees beside him, elegance abandoned without hesitation. The hem of her dress brushed the floor as she reached for him, one hand gripping his arm tightly, the other bracing against the table to steady herself. Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the evening, shattered in an instant. "Daniel," she whispered, fighting to keep her voice calm. "You're scaring me." Her words trembled despite her effort. Fear leaked through every syllable. Daniel looked at her, blinking slowly, as though the room itself were struggling to remain in focus. His pupils were dilated now, his gaze unfixed. When he spoke, his voice sounded unfamiliar even to himself. Thicker, slower, the edges blurred just enough to betray the truth beneath the words. "I'm fine," he said, "just dizzy." It was a lie he had likely practiced in his head, expecting to use it under very different circumstances. The kind of lies spoken out of habit rather than conviction. He tried to stand again. I could see the moment when pride overruled reason, when he decided that if he could just get to his feet, just regain the illusion of control, the room might reset itself. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though he might succeed. His legs straightened halfway. Then his knees buckled. He collapsed back against the chair, catching himself on the edge of the table. His fingers slid uselessly over the linen, bunching the cloth beneath his grip. The sound of silverware rattling echoed far louder than it should have. A low murmur spread outward, growing in volume as it traveled. Judge Albright, seated across from us, leaned forward slowly, deliberately. The deep lines etched into his brow formed an expression I recognized instantly. The look of a man who had seen this before, who knew instinctively that something far more serious was unfolding than simple overindulgence. "This doesn't look like too much wine," he said. The statement was not accusatory. It didn't need to be. It landed with the quiet authority of experience. Daniel's breathing became rapid and shallow. Each breath sounded like effort now, as though his lungs had forgotten how to work in rhythm. His fingers tightened around the tablecloth, knuckles whitening, nails digging into the fabric, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the room, to consciousness, to the life he had assumed would continue uninterrupted. Someone nearby suggested calling for medical help. The words barely finished forming before Daniel snapped back. "No." The single syllable came out sharp and forceful. Too forceful. Too fast. "I don't need a doctor." The refusal cut through the room like a glass shattering against stone. It drew attention more effectively than any collapse ever could have. Conversation stopped entirely now. Heads turned in unison. Nearby tables fell silent, curiosity hardening into concern. I felt the eyes of strangers settle on us, their expressions shifting from polite interest to something darker. The instinctive recognition that they were witnessing something they would remember. I watched all of it with an unsettling calm. Years on the bench had taught me how quickly panic spreads once uncertainty enters a space. I had seen orderly courtrooms unravel over a single unexpected testimony. I had watched juries fracture when one assumption collapsed. I had learned that chaos rarely announces itself loudly at first. It arrives quietly, through hesitation, through doubt, through the moment when people realize the rules they were following no longer apply. I had also learned that silence, controlled, deliberate silence, could be devastating. Daniel's wife turned to me then, her eyes wide, shining with fear and desperation. Her grip on his arm tightened, as if she were afraid he might vanish if she let go. "Uncle Thomas," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, say something." The room seemed to lean in. Before I could respond, Daniel turned toward me, whatever composure he had left finally slipping away. His face was pale now, a sheen of sweat visible along his hairline. His voice dropped, hoarse and strained, stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Alone." The word carried weight. Not secrecy, not strategy. Fear, raw and exposed. I leaned forward slightly, my movements measured, deliberate. The habits of a lifetime guided me now more than conscious thought ever could. I kept my voice low, steady, carefully neutral. "Perhaps you should tell us what's happening," I said. "That might help whoever comes to assist you." His eyes widened. For the first time that evening, he looked truly trapped. Not by the room, not by the witnesses, but by his own choices. The realization flickered across his face, unmistakable. Judge Albright straightened fully in his chair, authority settling into his posture like a familiar weight. When he spoke, his voice carried the same tone that had once commanded courtrooms into silence. "Young man," he said firmly, "your condition is deteriorating. If you've ingested something beyond alcohol, now is the time to say so." Daniel's mouth opened, closed. His jaw quivered visibly. A muscle twitched beneath his cheekbone. "I didn't mean," he started. The sentence never finished. A wave of dizziness overtook him, and he slumped forward slightly, catching himself at the last second. Sweat soaked through his collar, darkening the fabric. Beads of it gathered at his temples, tracing slow, unsteady paths down his face. His chest rose and fell erratically now, no longer under conscious control. His wife stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes with terrible clarity. "What did you do?" she whispered. The silence that followed felt absolute. It pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating. Even the background sounds of the restaurant seemed to retreat, as though the building itself were holding its breath. "I put something in his wine," Daniel said at last. The words spilled out in a rush, stripped of pretense, stripped of hope. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. He switched the glasses. I drank it. For a moment, no one reacted. Then the room erupted. A collective gasp swept through the tables closest to us. Chairs scraped backward as people stood instinctively, needing distance from what they had just heard. Someone swore under their breath. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. Daniel's wife recoiled as though physically struck. Her hand flew to her mouth, her face draining of color. She shook her head slowly, as if denying what she had heard might undo it. "You did what?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Judge Albright rose to his feet without hesitation. "Call emergency services," he said. "Now." Phones appeared in hands almost instantly. A server ran toward the kitchen, his face pale. The restraint that had held the room together finally snapped, and panic surged openly now, spilling into movement and noise. Daniel sagged back into his chair, utterly spent. His shoulders slumped. His head dipped forward. His eyes were glassy now, unfocused, clouded not only by whatever coursed through his system, but by something heavier. Shame. For a brief moment, his gaze met mine. There was no anger there, no accusation, no plea, only the dawning realization that the plan he had crafted so carefully, quietly, methodically, over months, had collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Only the hollow ache of a truth too large to undo. The boy I had raised had chosen his path, and now, in front of everyone who had gathered to honor my life's work, he was facing the consequences of his own design. The ambulance arrived within minutes, though it felt far longer. Time had begun to stretch in unnatural ways, each second expanding as if reluctant to move forward. The sound of the siren cut through the night air with a sharp insistence that felt almost accusatory, growing louder as it approached, announcing to everyone within earshot that something irrevocable had happened inside that restaurant. The entrance had become a narrow corridor of whispered speculation and restrained panic. Guests pressed themselves against the walls instinctively, stepping aside as if proximity alone might implicate them in what they had just witnessed. Conversations that had once been lively now existed only as hushed fragments. Questions half-formed, guesses abandoned before they could be spoken aloud. The paramedics moved with calm efficiency, the kind that comes from repetition rather than indifference. They knelt beside Daniel immediately, voices low, steady, practiced. "What did you take?" one of them asked, already preparing equipment, his hands moving with precision. Daniel's eyes fluttered as he tried to focus. He shook his head weakly. "I don't know exactly," he said. The paramedic paused, looking up sharply. "You don't know?" The words were not harsh, but they carried weight. Experience. Concern edged with frustration. "It was something a client gave me," Daniel murmured. His voice sounded distant, as though he were speaking from the end of a long hallway. "He said it would cause confusion, disorientation." The words landed heavily, even amid the urgency. I saw the subtle shift in the paramedic's expression, the tightening around the eyes, the unspoken recalculation of risk. Daniel's wife sat rigid in her chair nearby, arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at him as though he were a stranger who had wandered into her life by mistake. Her gaze wasn't accusatory anymore. It was searching, as if she were trying desperately to reconcile the man she had married with the one collapsing in front of her. I stood back, watching the scene unfold with the same measured distance I once used when observing defendants escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs. There was a time when I believed attachment made judgment easier. That distance protected fairness, objectivity, clarity. Tonight, it merely made the pain sharper, cleaner, harder to escape. As the paramedics lifted Daniel onto the stretcher, securing straps, adjusting monitors, he reached out blindly. His fingers brushed my sleeve, barely a touch, but enough. "Uncle Thomas," he whispered. "I didn't want this." His voice cracked on the last word. I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because any words offered in that moment would have been either dishonest or cruel. There are moments when silence is not avoidance, but mercy. They wheeled him out through the corridor that had once been filled with applause. Faces blurred past. Some watched openly, others looked away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the floor beneath their feet. The ride to the hospital passed in fragments. Sirens, red and blue lights reflecting off storefront windows and passing cars, stuttering across the inside of the ambulance like broken signals. The smell of antiseptic and rubber. Daniel's labored breathing punctuating the silence, uneven and strained. His wife sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead. Whatever anger she had felt earlier had burned itself out, leaving something colder behind. Shock has a way of doing that, stripping emotion down to its rawest core. Judge Albright insisted on accompanying us. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said simply. I didn't argue. The emergency department was bright and impersonal, fluorescent lights erasing any sense of time or place. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic beneath it. Nurses moved briskly, shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. A physician took charge immediately, asking questions, ordering tests, administering countermeasures based on best guesses and limited information. What substance? Any known allergies? Timeline of ingestion? I answered when asked. Clearly, precisely. Years of testimony had trained me well. Facts over feeling. Sequence over speculation. Hours seemed to pass, though I later learned it had been less than one. Time stretches differently in waiting rooms. Finally, a young doctor approached us. She looked tired but focused, her expression carefully neutral. "He's stable," she said. "We were able to counteract most of the substance." "He's fortunate." Fortunate. The word echoed in my mind, hollow and strange. Daniel's wife let out a shaky breath she had clearly been holding back. "Can I see him?" "In a few minutes." The doctor turned to me. "Law enforcement will want a statement." "I understand." The interview room was small and windowless, painted an indifferent shade of beige. The detective assigned to the case was direct, professional, and unflinching. She listened as I recounted the events of the evening, my words careful, factual, stripped of emotion. "You're aware," she said, "that switching the glasses intentionally could be viewed as retaliatory." "I'm aware of the law," I replied evenly. "I'm also aware that the person who introduces a dangerous substance bears responsibility for its consequences." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll investigate thoroughly." When I returned to the waiting area, Daniel's wife was pacing. "How could you let him drink it?" she demanded, turning on me suddenly. "You knew." I met her gaze steadily. I did not raise my voice. "He chose to poison someone," I said. "He drank what he prepared." Judge Albright stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "Direct your anger appropriately. Your husband's actions created this outcome." The words struck their mark. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing, hands covering her face as the reality she had been avoiding finally claimed its due. Later, in Daniel's hospital room, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The monitors beeped softly. Clear tubes ran from his arm. His skin looked pale beneath the harsh light. The confidence that once defined him had evaporated completely. "I'm sorry," he said, tears streaking down his face. "I was desperate. I'm drowning in debt. Hundreds of thousands. I thought if something happened to you, just a scare, I could fix everything. You plan to endanger my life to solve your finances," I said quietly. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "What happens now?" his wife asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," I said, standing slowly, "the law takes its course. And so do we." Daniel reached for me again. "Please, I need you." I looked at him one last time. "I raised you to face consequences," I said. "This is one of them." And I walked out. The trial moved faster than I expected. I had assumed there would be delays, procedural tangles, motions filed simply to buy time. That is how the system often works, even when guilt is clear. But this case moved forward with an efficiency that felt almost merciful, as though everyone involved understood that prolonging it would serve no one. There was no dramatic defense, no attempt to reshape Daniel's actions into misunderstanding or accident, no performance meant to confuse rather than clarify. Too many witnesses had heard his confession that night. Too many respected voices, judges, attorneys, officers of the court, had confirmed the sequence of events with precision. The evidence was not just sufficient, it was overwhelming. Daniel pled guilty. He did so without negotiation, without posturing, without the bravado that had once defined him. When he stood to enter the plea, his voice was steady but empty, as though the words no longer carried the weight they once did. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not look toward me. The charge was assault with a dangerous substance. Intent was established not by inference, but by preparation, by his own words, his own planning, his own admission. The sentence, while measured, was firm. Incarceration, probation to follow, and the permanent loss of his license to practice law. That last consequence seemed to land hardest. Law had been Daniel's identity, the proof he had made something of himself, the validation that his life, after loss and upheaval, had meaning and direction. To lose it was not simply professional punishment, it was erasure. I attended the sentencing alone. I did not ask anyone to come with me, nor did anyone offer. It was a moment that felt intensely personal, even as it unfolded in a public courtroom. I sat in the gallery, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching a young judge read the sentence with solemn care. She had been one of my clerks years earlier. When she asked if I wished to make a statement, I declined. There was nothing I could say that would improve the outcome or soothe the wound. Any words offered in that space would have felt performative, self-serving, or cruel. Silence, I had learned, was sometimes the only honest response. Daniel stood when the sentence was read, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like the frightened 13-year-old who had once stood in my doorway with a single suitcase, unsure whether he belonged anywhere at all. The boy had asked me, quietly, if he could stay. Then the moment passed. He nodded once, stiffly, and sat back down. His wife filed for divorce within weeks. I learned of it through a brief message from her attorney, formal and restrained. There were no accusations directed at me, no demands, no attempts to reopen wounds. I did not contest any settlement, nor did I intervene. Their marriage was no longer my responsibility. That realization brought a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. The house took longer to sell. 36 years of living leaves a deep imprint on a place. Walls absorb sound, memory, habit. Every room in that house carried echoes. Arguments over homework, quiet evenings by the fire, laughter that once felt permanent and now felt impossibly distant. I walked through it often while waiting for an offer. The kitchen where Daniel had sprawled over textbooks late into the night. The hallway where he had paced during phone calls, convinced his future depended on the outcome of a single case. The guest room that had become his bedroom, then his refuge, then his departure point. When the offer finally came from a young family with 2 children, I accepted it without negotiation. I did not want to linger. Watching them explore the halls on closing day was harder than I anticipated. They spoke of paint colors and furniture placement, discussing where a crib might go, where a desk would fit best. They laughed easily, unaware of the life that had unfolded within those walls. Perhaps that was for the best. A house should not carry grief forward. I kept little. My law books went to the county law library. The furniture was sold or donated. The crystal and china were given away, carefully wrapped, as though fragility still mattered. What remained fit into a few boxes. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. Forgiveness is not always a gift one can give without betraying oneself. That understanding did not come easily, but it came honestly. On a crisp autumn morning, standing on my porch with a cup of coffee warming my hands, I realized something I never expected. I was not lonely. The role that had defined me for decades, protector, provider, moral compass, was gone. In its absence, I discovered a quieter identity, one unburdened by responsibility for another man's choices. The past remained, the scars remained, but so did the future. And for the first time in many years, it belonged solely to me. Time is a strange thing after betrayal. It doesn't erase memory, as people like to say. It doesn't soften it into something vague or merciful. Instead, it reorganizes it. It lifts certain moments out of their original order and places them front and center, while pushing others quietly to the margins. It dulls some edges and sharpens others. It preserves details you would swear should have faded. The tone of voice, the angle of a glance, the weight of silence. while allowing entire weeks to slip away unnoticed. The mind, I've learned, is less interested in forgiveness than it is in survival. In the months after the sentencing, I found myself thinking often about the man I had been before that dinner. Not with nostalgia and not with self-reproach, but with the same measured curiosity I once brought to close cases. I revisited that version of myself the way a judge reviews a file long after the verdict has been rendered, not to overturn it, but to understand how the outcome became inevitable. The judge, the guardian, the uncle who believed love, discipline, and opportunity could shape character as reliably as law shapes outcomes. I had believed that if you gave someone enough structure, enough patience, enough belief, they would eventually choose the right path. That consistency could outlast fear. That example could outweigh desperation. That values, once taught deeply enough, would surface when they mattered most. I had believed that character was something you could build the way you build precedent, carefully, methodically, reinforced over time. I had been wrong. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. Betrayal, painful as it is, comes from another person. It wounds from the outside. This pain came from within, from recognizing that my understanding of influence and responsibility had been incomplete, that I had mistaken guidance for protection and care for control, that I had believed love could act as a safeguard against choice. Choice, I learned, is immune to love. When I left the city, I told myself I was seeking quiet. That was only partly true. What I was really seeking was distance, not just from Daniel or the courthouse or the memory of that night, but from the version of myself who had believed he could prevent the worst outcomes through vigilance alone. The cabin sat on several acres of wooded land, far from the roads and routines that had once defined my days. It was modest, practical, the kind of place chosen not to impress, but to endure. When I first arrived, it felt almost too quiet, as though the absence of sound were a presence of its own. Mornings began before sunrise, not because I needed to be awake, but because habit is stubborn. Old rhythms persist long after the structures that created them have dissolved. I would lie still for a moment, listening to the subtle sounds of the woods, wind moving through branches, the distant call of birds, the faint settling of the house as temperature shifted. The world felt paused at that hour, not asleep, not awake, waiting. Mist often clung low to the ground, drifting between the trees like something undecided, not yet committed to becoming fog or vanishing entirely. Birds announced the day with confidence I found myself envying. No hesitation, no doubt, just instinct in motion. I made coffee the same way every morning. Measured, unrushed. The ritual mattered more than the result. The sound of water heating, the smell of grounds blooming, the familiar warmth of the cup settling into my hands. Small acts, repeated daily, became anchors in a life that had lost its larger framework. For most of my adult life, I had been defined by responsibility to the court, to the public, to Daniel. Responsibility shaped my schedule, my priorities, even my sense of self. It dictated when I woke, when I slept, what I read, what I carried in my mind long after leaving the office. Without it, I felt exposed at first, like a man who had set down a heavy load only to realize he no longer knew what to do with his hands. There were moments in those early weeks when the quiet felt accusatory, when I wondered whether stepping away had been abandonment disguised as wisdom, whether distance was strength or cowardice wearing a respectable mask. I replayed conversations I had had with Daniel over the years, not looking for warning signs anymore, but for reassurance that I had done what I could. I remembered teaching him to argue both sides of a position, to anticipate counterpoints, to never underestimate unintended consequences. I wondered when he had stopped listening. But gradually, something shifted. The silence stopped demanding answers. It began offering space. I began volunteering more regularly at the local courthouse. The building was smaller than the one I had worked in for decades. Less imposing, more human. People arrived carrying folders and envelopes clutched too tightly, their fear evident before they spoke a word. I did not sit behind a bench anymore. I sat beside them. I explained forms, clarified procedures, translated legal language into something accessible. I listened. Listening had always been my greatest tool. As a judge, it had been sharpened by authority. Every word carried weight because it could alter lives. Now, without authority attached to it, listening felt purer, less transactional, more honest. There was a woman in her early 30s who came in one afternoon, her hands shaking as she spoke. She was terrified she would lose custody of her son because she could not afford representation. She had done nothing criminal, nothing reckless. She had simply lived too close to the edge of stability for too long. I spent hours with her, walking her through each document, explaining timelines, preparing her for what to expect, what to say, and what not to say. I watched her shoulders relax incrementally as understanding replaced fear. When she thanked me afterward, tears in her eyes, something loosened in my chest that I hadn't realized was still clenched. This, I thought, was justice too. Not verdicts, not punishment, but clarity offered before fear becomes paralysis. On weekends, I hiked the trails that wound through the hills behind my property. The physical exertion was grounding, honest. There were no arguments to weigh, no motives to dissect, no credibility to assess. Only breath, movement, and the quiet acceptance of distance traveled. I found comfort in progress measured by steps rather than outcomes. Sometimes, halfway up a trail, I would stop and look back, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to see how far I had come without realizing it. The view reminded me that movement does not always announce itself. Often, it reveals itself only in retrospect. I made friends, though slowly. A retired couple who lived down the road invited me to their weekly card game. They spoke of weather, grandchildren, minor disputes with the homeowners association. A librarian asked if I would help with a legal clinic she ran for low-income residents. Conversations were simple, unburdened. No one knew my history unless I chose to share it. And I didn't. For the first time since Daniel was a boy, I was not responsible for guiding someone else's life. That freedom, once frightening, became restorative. It allowed me to observe without intervening, to care without carrying. I learned that compassion does not require control. One evening, late in the autumn, my phone rang as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air had turned crisp, the first real promise of winter settling in. The caller was a former clerk. She spoke carefully, as though unsure whether the information she carried was a burden or a courtesy. She told me Daniel had been released early for good behavior, that he had asked whether anyone knew how to reach me. I listened quietly. "I didn't give him your information," she said. "I told him I wouldn't without your permission." "Thank you," I replied. After the call ended, I remained on the porch long after darkness settled over the trees. The world narrowed to breath and stillness. I searched myself for anger, for fear, for obligation, for guilt. What I found instead was distance. Not coldness, not cruelty, just distance. Daniel had chosen his path. He would have to continue walking it without me. That night, I took out the letter he had written from prison, the one I'd set aside months earlier. I read it again, slowly. His remorse seemed genuine, his self-awareness newly formed. He wrote of rehabilitation programs, of humility learned too late, of wanting to live differently. I believed him. Those memories did not hurt the way I expected them to. They arrived without accusation, without demand. They were simply facts, evidence of a life lived alongside another, not proof of obligation or error. I began to understand something that had eluded me for years. Memory does not ask permission, but meaning does. I had spent too long allowing the past to dictate the present, confusing remembrance with responsibility. Winter, in its quiet insistence, stripped that illusion away. I continued volunteering at the courthouse, though less frequently as snow made travel difficult. When I did go, the building felt warmer than before, not in temperature, but in tone. People recognized me now, not as a judge, not as an authority, but as someone who listened without judgment. There was an elderly man one morning who arrived, clutching a notice he did not understand. He had missed a deadline. He was terrified he would lose his home. We sat together for nearly an hour, tracing timelines, identifying options. When he left, he shook my hand with a grip far stronger than his frame suggested. "Thank you," he said. "You treated me like I mattered." That sentence stayed with me. For decades, I had believed respect came from position, from titles, from the authority to decide outcomes. Now I understood something quieter and more enduring. Respect comes from presence. The trails behind my property changed with the season. Snow softened their edges, muffled sound, erased familiar markers. Walking them required attention now, careful footing, deliberate pace. I welcomed the demand. It forced me into the present moment, away from speculation and regret. Sometimes I stopped mid-trail, listening to the absence of sound. No traffic, no voices, only wind moving through branches, the distant crack of ice settling. In those moments, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not relief. Peace. It was subtle, fragile, but real. Late one afternoon, as dusk settled early and the sky faded into a pale gray, my phone rang again. This time, I knew who it would be before I answered. The former clerk sounded hesitant. She did not need to explain why she was calling. She told me Daniel had asked again whether anyone had heard from me, that he seemed changed, quieter. "I don't expect you to do anything," she said quickly. "I just thought you should know." "I appreciate that," I replied. After the call ended, I did not sit down immediately. I stood near the window, watching snow begin to fall, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Each flake seemed to make its own decision about where to land. I felt no surge of anger, no rush of obligation, only a mild curiosity, distant and contained. The letter from Daniel remained where I had placed it months earlier, inside a drawer I rarely opened. I took it out again that night, not with urgency, but with intention. I read it more carefully this time, paying attention not just to what he said, but how he said it. The words were thoughtful, structured, reflective. They were also late. That realization did not diminish their sincerity. It simply contextualized it. Regret does not reverse action. Insight does not undo harm. I folded the letter and returned it to the drawer. Forgiveness, I was learning, is not an event. It is not a declaration. It is a posture toward the past. And sometimes, the most honest posture is neutrality. Not absolution, not condemnation, but release. As winter deepened, I marked the passing of time not by calendars, but by small changes. The way light shifted on the snow, the way my breath fogged more quickly, the way silence felt less heavy. I slept deeply. Dreams came and went without urgency. When Daniel appeared in them, he did not speak. He simply existed, present, but no longer central. That felt significant. I realized then how much of my identity had been built around being needed, around solving, guiding, intervening. Without that role, I had feared emptiness. What I found instead was space. Space to observe, space to choose, space to be unfinished. One evening, while sorting through boxes I had never fully unpacked, I came across my judicial robe. The fabric was heavier than I remembered. I held it for a long moment, tracing the seams, remembering the weight it carried. Not physically, but symbolically. I folded it carefully and placed it back. That chapter was complete. The first anniversary of my retirement dinner approached quietly. I did not mark it on a calendar. I felt it instead, a subtle tension beneath the surface, like pressure before a change in weather. On that morning, I woke earlier than usual. Before the birds, before the light. I dressed without deliberation and drove toward a nearby overlook I had discovered months earlier. The road was empty. As the sun rose, the sky burned gold and crimson, spilling light across the mountains. I stood there alone, hands in my coat pockets, breath visible in the cold air. I did not think about Daniel. I did not think about the courtroom. I thought about continuity, about the fact that life does not end when relationships fracture. It does not pause for grief to resolve itself neatly. It moves forward, carrying what remains and shedding what cannot continue. I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only clarity. I had survived betrayal without becoming bitter. I had upheld my principles without sacrificing my safety. I had lost a relationship that defined much of my adulthood, and in doing so, reclaim my remaining years. That realization did not feel like victory. It felt like balance restored. I understood then that justice is not always something imposed. Sometimes it is something accepted, a quiet acknowledgement that consequences exist independently of our wishes. I returned to the cabin later that morning, warmed soup, and sat at the table watching steam rise slowly from a bowl. The ordinary nature of the moment struck me with unexpected force. Ordinary is not lesser. Ordinary is earned. I no longer sat on a bench. I no longer carried the weight of other people's choices. What remained was quieter, and it was enough. As winter loosened its grip and the first signs of spring began to surface, I noticed a subtle change in myself long before I noticed it in the landscape. The snow did not vanish all at once. It retreated slowly, reluctantly, lingering in shaded places as if unwilling to admit the season had turned. The ground softened. Streams swelled with meltwater. Birds returned in uneven numbers, tentative at first, then confident. Change, it was reminded, rarely arrives decisively. Inside the cabin, light began to stretch further into the evenings. Shadows shifted. Windows that once reflected only darkness now held the faint glow of dusk. I found myself sitting longer at the table after dinner, not because I had nowhere else to be, but because I no longer felt the urge to rush away from stillness. For much of my life, stillness had been something to endure between obligations. Now it was something to inhabit. With the return of longer days came a different kind of reflection. Winter had been about survival, about narrowing, conserving, holding steady. Spring brought examination. Questions surfaced not with urgency, but with persistence. They did not demand answers immediately. They simply waited. The most persistent of these questions concerned legacy. I had spent decades believing that legacy was something built through influence, through mentorship, guidance, example. I had assumed that the lives I touched, particularly Daniel's, would carry forward the values I had tried to instill. That continuity was the natural outcome of care. Now, stripped of that assumption, I was forced to ask myself a quieter, more difficult question. Who am I, separate from what I try to shape? It was an uncomfortable inquiry. Without the bench, without Daniel, without the role of guardian or authority, I had feared there would be nothing left but absence. Instead, I discovered something subtler. Presence without ownership. I continued volunteering at the courthouse, though the work felt different now. Less like restitution, more like choice. I was not there to atone. I was there because the work mattered and because I wanted to be. One afternoon, a young man arrived visibly defensive, his posture rigid, his answers clipped. He had been cited for a minor offense and believed the system was aligned against him. As he spoke, I recognized something painfully familiar. Pride wrapped around fear. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I asked a single question, not legal but human. What outcome are you most afraid of? He hesitated, then exhaled. Being seen as a screw-up, he said. We talked for a long time after that. I did not lecture. I did not correct. I simply listened and explained what options existed, what consequences meant, and what they did not. When he left, his shoulders were less rigid. Not relaxed, but no longer braced for impact. That mattered. Walking back to my car that afternoon, I realized something I had never fully grasped while sitting on the bench. Authority resolves cases. Presence resolves people. The distinction felt important. As spring settled fully into the valley, my routines expanded. Longer walks, more time outdoors. The trails behind the cabin transformed again, no longer demanding careful navigation, but inviting exploration. New growth filled spaces that winter had rendered empty. I noticed how easily the land accepted change. Trees did not mourn fallen branches. Streams did not apologize for eroding their banks. Everything adjusted without explanation or regret. Humans, I thought, complicate what nature accepts instinctively. The question of forgiveness returned to me often during those walks. Not forgiveness as an act toward Daniel, but forgiveness as a concept I had misunderstood for most of my life. I had believed forgiveness was a moral obligation, a duty aligned with compassion, something offered to repair what had been broken. I now understood that belief had been incomplete. Forgiveness, I learned, is not synonymous with access. You can forgive someone and still refuse proximity. You can release anger without restoring trust. You can acknowledge remorse without reopening your life. This distinction brought a sense of calm I had not expected. Daniel's letter remained in its drawer. I did not avoid it, but I did not feel compelled by it either. It existed as part of the past, not a demand upon the present. I thought about how easily I once measured worth through permanence, through outcomes that endured, through decisions that could not be undone. Fireflies, I realized, illuminate without lasting. And yet, they matter. The phone rang again late that summer. A number I did not recognize. I let go to voicemail. The message was brief, careful. It was Daniel. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for reconciliation. He said only that he hoped I was well, that he was trying to live differently, and that he understood if silence was my choice. I listened once. Then I deleted the message. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Responding would not help him. Remaining silent would not harm him. Sometimes restraint is the most honest response. That night, I slept deeply, dreamless. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something quietly profound. I no longer rehearsed conversations that would never happen. I no longer imagined explanations I did not owe. I no longer carried Daniel's future as an extension of my own. The separation was complete. Not cold, not cruel, complete. I understood then that reconciliation is not the same as resolution. That some stories end without reunion, and that ending can still be whole. As summer matured, I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what remained. Time, health, clarity. These were not small things. One afternoon, while standing at the edge of the woods watching sunlight filter through leaves, I realized I no longer felt defined by what had happened to me. I was defined by how I had responded. I had not retaliated. I had not concealed truth. I had not abandoned my principles to preserve comfort. That mattered. If the law had taught me anything over the decades, it was that integrity is not proven by ease, but by restraint. This was my restraint. I did not seek vindication. I did not seek restoration. I sought balance, and I had found it. By late summer, the days no longer felt like something I had to fill. That realization arrived without ceremony. One morning, while standing at the kitchen sink washing a single cup, I noticed there was no urgency in my movements. No silent checklist running beneath my thoughts. No sense that time was something I needed to outrun or control. For most of my life, time had been an adversary. Deadlines, calendars, dockets, a future always arriving faster than anticipated. Now, time felt like an environment rather than a force. Something I moved within, not against. I understood then that peace is not the absence of memory. It is the absence of resistance to it. The cabin bore the marks of the seasons it had already seen with me. Small changes accumulated quietly. A worn patch near the door where boots were removed, a stack of books by the chair that rotated slowly as interests shifted, a calendar that went unchecked for days at a time. I had not planned to stay permanently when I arrived. I stayed because nothing compelled me to leave. On one of my walks late that summer, I came across a fallen tree blocking the trail. It had not snapped violently. There was no splintering chaos. It had simply yielded under its own weight, roots lifted slowly from the ground. New growth had already begun to gather around it. Moss clung to the bark. Insects moved freely across what had once stood upright. Nature, I reflected, does not interpret collapse as failure. It interprets it as transition. I sat there for a long time, not because the moment was profound, but because it felt instructive. Daniel's absence in my life no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like scar tissue, present, undeniable, but no longer tender. It did not limit movement. It simply reminded me of where healing had occurred. That distinction mattered. There were still moments when memory surfaced unexpectedly. A phrase he used to repeat, a particular laugh, a turn of logic I recognized immediately as his. But those moments no longer carried a sense of responsibility. They arrived, lingered briefly, and passed on. I did not follow them. One afternoon, While sorting through papers in preparation for downsizing further, I came across my retirement announcement. The words felt distant now, written by someone who believed that endings were more deliberate than they are. I folded the paper and placed it in a box marked "Simply Completed." That felt sufficient. I continued volunteering, though I no longer framed it as service. It was participation, a way of remaining connected without being central. When people thanked me, I accepted it without deflection or obligation. I did not correct them. I did not minimize. Gratitude, I had learned, is not something to be managed. It is something to be received. One afternoon, a young clerk asked me why I never returned to the bench, even part-time. The question was curious, not probing. I consider my answer carefully. Because I no longer need authority to feel useful, I said. She nodded, not fully understanding, but respecting the certainty in my tone. That was enough. As autumn returned, marking a full cycle since the night everything changed, I felt no urge to commemorate the date. Anniversaries no longer carried weight for me. They suggested a need for accounting that I no longer felt. Instead, I focused on continuity. I planted a small garden behind the cabin. Nothing ambitious. Herbs, a few vegetables. The act of tending to something that responded slowly felt appropriate. Plants do not hurry to reassure you. They grow on their own terms. Failure in gardening is not personal. Success is never absolute. That balance appealed to me. Occasionally, I thought of Daniel not as he was at the end, but as he had been at the beginning. A boy shaped by loss, by disruption, by the quiet pressure to become something worthy of rescue. I no longer framed his choices as ingratitude. They were his. That distinction freed me from interpretation. Late one evening, while sitting on the porch as dusk settled into the valley, I received a letter forwarded by my attorney. There was no return address. I knew immediately who it was from. I did not open it right away. Instead, I sat with it beside me, watching the light fade. The envelope was thin, unassuming. It carried no urgency in its weight. When I finally opened it, I read slowly. Daniel did not apologize again. He did not ask for contact. He wrote only that he hoped I was well, that he had found work unrelated to law, and that he understood why silence might be the only possible outcome between us. He ended by saying that he no longer expected forgiveness, only accountability for his own life. I folded the letter carefully. For the first time, I did not place it in a drawer. I placed it in the fire. The paper caught quickly, the flame-consuming words that had already served their purpose. There was no anger in the act, no finality, just completion. Some chapters do not require preservation. That night, I slept without dreams. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, not because something had been resolved, but because nothing remained unresolved. That distinction is subtle and essential. I realized then that closure is not an event. It is a state. It arrives when nothing inside you is waiting for something outside to change. By the time winter returned again, I no longer thought of my life in terms of what had been lost. I thought of it in terms of what had been clarified. I understood my limits. I understood my values. I understood that love offered does not obligate love returned. I no longer sat on a bench. I no longer carried the weight of other people's choices. What remained was quieter, not empty, not diminished, quieter. And finally, it was mine.